As was said, I'm Robert Perry Cruz, and we are here today to talk about why behavior analysts should study attendance, the example of school refusal, with thanks to Fryman, Hayes, and Wilson for their why behavior analysts should study emotions. So we already had a great introduction, so we don't need to belabor the point too long on the who we are, but there we are at a previous Thompson Center event. We want to say big thanks again to the Thompson Center for inviting us back. Every year we've done a talk. We say, I wonder if this is the one where they realize they don't have to keep inviting us back, but hopefully that won't be the case today. So we're very happy to be here to talk about a subject that many of you, show of hands, how many of you came here because you actively are supporting families and schools with school attendance problems and you're hoping to get all the answers today? Okay, we got a good amount of hands. All right. How many of you came because you said, I've never heard of this. I just want to hear about what the heck this is and why I, as a behavior analyst or practitioner in a related field, should know about it? Okay, so mostly people who've heard about it some, and then some who have never heard about it before. So great, that's our goal today. For us, how did we learn about school attendance problems? Jackie and Diana, I don't want to answer for you, but I'm pretty sure you learned about it because I said, hey, this is a problem I'm having, and then we talked about it, and then we had done a couple episodes about it in the past on the show. For me, it was like many of you, hey, there's a giant problem. I work in a school system, so often the BCBA gets called in when, hey, giant problem with multiple players. I assume you'll know how to fix it, and I'll leave and let you do your thing. Does anyone have that as an activity sometimes happens? You'll get it, you'll figure it out. And of course, we do what we always do, which is let's see what there is in the research about school attendance problems. School refusal is usually the one that is the most common. And you go to the research and you find very little behavior analytic research, if any. There's some psychologists who are probably, who would be considered behavior analysts, but really we don't have a lot. So it became one of those things that I was curious about. Why not? When you look at a lot of the factors, it's something that I feel, and I think we've all talked about feeling, we should be able to be a part of the conversation. We should be able to come up with better assessments and treatments, yet it doesn't seem to be something that I ever hear talked about. So we said, let's put together what we have and let's bring it up to the group. Now, we may leave and you'll come find us at the table and say, there's tons of research and you totally missed it. And my bad if that's the case. But I looked a lot and did not see a lot that I would consider behavior analytic in nature. So we're going to talk about why that might be. So our goals today are to understand how prevalent school attendance problems are and some possible risk factors or related risk factors. We're going to talk about hypothesized functions of school refusal, specifically as one type of school avoidance problem, and some treatment options. And then we're going to talk about what are the limitations with what is known in science in general and what behavior analysts could do to further support improvements in the treatment and assessment of school attendance problems. So, school refusal, what is it? When I first started hearing about school refusal or thinking about school refusal, I thought of myself and, my mental health days when I was in high school or the days when I hadn't finished my homework and I asked my mom, could I just stay home and finish it? I'll go tomorrow, right? So it seemed like one of those innocuous things that all children and adolescents do to some extent. Let's see if this clip works. Well, in the interest of time, think about Bart Simpson going to school. Sorry, everyone. It was a hilarious clip. You would have loved it. But in the interest of time, think about, a kid just going to school and deciding, I don't want to go. And everyone gives them a lot of pressure and they say, fine, I will go to school, right? That's a lot of what I used to think about school refusal. I don't know how many of you have ever been a part of the baby center email group. Maybe if some of you have small children, they send you an email letter every couple weeks or every week or so until your child's about 8 or 9. And they give you some tips. And I saw this one as we were preparing for the presentation for 7 3/4-year-old was the title of that. And they referred to it as school shirking, which one of the issues I have with school attendance problems as a whole is there's too many terms and all of them mean very little. But their advice was pretty good, so I'm going to read it really quickly. So, occasionally a child who likes school decides he doesn't like it. Then what? Barring illness, often the root problem is that your child is afraid of something going on at school. Missed homework, a problem with a classmate, an upcoming test. Sometimes it's the more conscientious and bright kids who work themselves into pretzels, worrying over academics. Try probing around these possibilities to see if there's a trouble spot. Email the teacher to ask if he's noticed anything. Sometimes a child who's been allowed to stay home sick grows to like the attention and is eager to stay with mom or dad. Flattering as this may be, once your child is well, he needs to be sent back. Check for fever or other signs of illness first. If your child is insistent that he doesn't feel well, a doctor visit or the threat of one may resolve the matter. So other than threatening to take your child to the doctor, this actually isn't too far removed from sort of where I've seen the consensus in terms of treatment research. It's a lot of, well, parents need to do some stuff. It could be these reasons. Try to ask them why, and hopefully they'll tell you, and then tell them don't worry about it, and then make sure they don't have a medical issue. As many of you would know, as treatment, that's not a bad idea for a student or a child who is maybe just a little hesitant to go to school. But usually for those of you who have been supporting families in schools with school attendance problems, it's usually not to that sort of minor level of intensity. So this advice, while not bad, is missing a lot of really rich information. So how big a problem is school attendance? I think the answer might have been a little bit different pre-pandemic, before, I think every year after, how hard it is to get kids back to school, how terrible remote school went during our shutdown periods. But really, it's not surprising that we have school attendance problems, in that there have been school attendance problems in research since school was invented as it is today, at least here in America. Some of the early studies on school attendance problems dated back to like 1915. Looking at global rates, we have about 17% of children worldwide who have some sort of a school attendance problem. This is going to vary quite a bit based on where in the world they are, with certainly more developing countries having school attendance problems that have more to do with access or safety to go to school, whereas, say, in Western developed countries, it may be more what we think of as school attendance problems, like that refusal, like kids don't want to go to school, something about school they don't like, broadly. But when we look here in the United States, about 10 to 15% of United States children are missing school, chronically missing school, meaning they miss 10% or more of school. That works out to about 18 full days of school. Now, when you look at different groups, you see this number begin to rise. So certainly students who receive free and reduced lunches are more likely to have school attendance problems. There's a 5 times increase for LGB. I say LGB just because that was what was in the research. I would assume LGBTQ across that spectrum would have a similar challenge with going to school. It's a 5 times increase of school attendance problems. You also see an increase in the percentage of students with intellectual disabilities who have school attendance problems. About 17.3% of students with an autism spectrum diagnosis also can struggle with school attendance for a variety of reasons. I'm looking at a study out of the UK. 43% of their group that surveyed were having school attendance problems specifically related to a refusal to go to school, an active involvement of the child of not going to school. It's about 1 to 7% in the research of autistic students who avoid going to school for any number of different reasons. So it's something that is prevalent among all students, but definitely with some of our different populations, our populations in need of additional services, we do see this number increase. The other question that often comes up with school attendance problems is, like, who cares? Like, we all missed a day of school here or there, right? And we're all here at a conference. You know, we have lots of degrees. It probably doesn't matter that much, except for maybe just a couple kids. But what is really coming out in the research right now is that you see a lot of short-term effects of school attendance problems, but it also seems to have a really additive effect. There's a little bit debate of how much the effect adds up to, but more and more and more you're seeing a lot of school systems, school districts across the country speaking about how every day matters, every day counts, and really trying to hammer home that message. Students not going to school for short periods of time will result in what you'd expect. They would have declining academic performance, but it also is going to result in a lot of social challenges. I know one thing that I've seen with a lot of students who are really want to go back to school, but for some reason they are having difficulty attending regularly. One of the things that happens over time is they become very scared. What's everyone going to say? What do I tell them when I come back, especially among adolescents and high school students? You see this as a very common problem. So now you're dealing with more functions than you started with when it comes to how did the school attendance problem develop. You also see a lot of family conflict, especially for students who are actively struggling to get to school. That causes a lot of stress in the families. And for those of you who do work in the school systems, you'll know that as families become more and more stressed, they are counting on the school to do more and more to help them. But the school is also very stressed about the problem as well and may not have the tools to deal with it, which can lead to a lot of extra conflict. And when it comes to attendance problems, or really any behavioral treatment, we want to simplify things as much as possible. So we really really have kind of a powder keg of difficult situations that we can find ourselves in. And then looking at long-term challenges, students who miss or attend less than 80% of their school day have only a 10 to 20% chance that they'll even graduate on time. So it really does seem to be that the more they miss, even over a period of time, a day here, half day here, it does add up and decrease the chances that they'll be able to graduate on time, which will increase the chance that they may drop out of school entirely. Attendance problems are also often linked to additional, increased drug use, increased mental health disorders, and certainly we know that students who don't finish high school tend to have a higher rate of unemployment, which can lead to a whole host of other problems. So it does seem that a day here and a day there can result in some serious problems for students. So where does school attendance problems come from is another question. And this is where I think we get to some of the reasons that BCBAs and behavior analysts might not be as active in the field of treatment for school attendance problems. Historically, there were a lot of reasons for school attendance problems that had more to do with sort of the structure of our schools. So if you think back to the early 20th centuries, when everyone must go to school was sort of becoming the new phenomenon, a lot of students didn't go to school because they had lack of access living in rural areas, or their parents pulled them out of school to help work on family farms. That's less of an issue now, though access is still an issue in some parts of the country. But as we started seeing more consistent attendance and more kind of urbanization of some of our school systems, more suburbanization of the school systems, we started seeing more descriptions of the kids not going to school as having some sort of like a mentalistic view of why they weren't going. They have a neuroses, or they're overly attracted to their parents. So a lot of very much blame-based language. A lot of the language also really came from our legal system, the idea of a truant student. And for many, many years, what's the treatment for families who struggle to get their child to school? You get a truant officer who will force the child to go to school. And of course, when they get there, that child will realize the error of their ways and continue going to school forever and ever. That is not typically what happens, and nor do we really like our systems ethically that really focus on, well, if we punish enough, it'll all work out in the end. That's not really what we stand for. You'd also see a lot of descriptions of like, well, that's the bad family on the other side of town with their bad kids, and all they want to do is drink and smoke. It's like that scene out of Pinocchio, when the kids go to Pleasure Island and they all turn into donkeys for their bad ways. That's why kids don't go to school. And you saw this for a lot. Not all researchers, certainly, but this did sort of seem to be the trend. And, well, it's internal problems and it's bad families, which is also an internal problem, as far as society would be concerned at the time. In the late 80s and then early 90s, we had Christopher Carney, who's out in, I believe, one of the schools out in Nevada, who's really one of the main publishers on the issue of school attendance problems. He's a psychologist, but would also be considered a behavior analyst, and was looking at the functions of school attendance problems, specifically refusal of students going to school, so problem behavior around going to school. And so that sort of changed the idea of we could look at other contexts that aren't so blame-driven. Some of those are going to be things like medical issues that families and students face. Certainly students who have a lot of medical needs will have a lot of medical appointments, which require them not being in school for periods of time. We also see that there are a lot of variables related to family life that can impact the prevalence of school attendance problems. So certainly parents who have mental health issues, depression, or their own anxiety, you often will see those be risk factors for school attendance problems. Also, parents who are unemployed tend to have children who have a harder time going to school. Now again, we don't know whether that is the parents are unemployed and therefore struggling to find work, they're too busy to pay attention to if their child is going to school, or the flip side, whether the parent is unemployed because they were fired because they needed to spend all their time trying to get their child to school. So again, these are contextual factors, none of these are causal. The schools themselves are a real source of why children might or might not engage in more or less school attendance problems. A lot of families in a lot of studies out of the Netherlands, like a big meta-analysis they did a couple years ago on kind of what works for treating school attendance problems, reported that a lot of the classrooms that their children were in were unorganized. They did not have classroom management systems. They focused on little rates of praise, mostly on punishment type systems, and were unsupportive of their children. And that is why the children weren't going to school. Again, it's more complicated than that, in that many teachers will talk about how they were very supportive. But how were they supportive? Well, students with anxiety, they report that when they seemed upset or frustrated, they would often remove demands, remove tasks, accommodate to try to make them feel better, which again is a kind thing to do, but as we know from thinking about anxiety or anxiety treatment, always removing stressors doesn't teach an individual how to deal with those stressors. And there is a correlation between the amount of accommodation a teacher will do for a child with anxiety and the amount of avoidance and then eventually full-out school refusal or school attendance problems that can develop. We also have the ecological variables related to things like, are schools safe? For many students, they can be very scared, depending on where their school is, to go to school, both internally in terms of bullying for differences like for LGBTQ students, for students on the autism spectrum, or for just the community makeup. There's a high rate of violence. There's a high rate of maybe gun violence or possession of guns that can make going to school more unsafe for students. So again, all of these are potential factors that need to be taken into account when thinking about school attendance problems, but it still doesn't get to what we would think of as the function of a school attendance problem. It might, but again, it doesn't give us a full picture. One of the challenges then runs into, well, I want to learn more about this, I want to come up with effective treatment, is when you look at the literature, what is this even called? Here's some old terms that I love from some old papers. There's a great review by Hine, who was one of the two kind of people who publish almost exclusively on school attendance problems, who just went through the history of terms. And again, you can sort of see that history of mentalistic language, that blame language, legal truancy language. I'm particularly fond of school phobia, which is not really used. The idea like the child is just terrified of schools and pictures of schools. If that were the only problem, there are treatments for phobias. And then, of course, mother files, which implies that the child has way too much attention from their mother. Again, if their mother only had parented them better, right, they'd be in school now. It's not anybody else's fault. But then you certainly see just a lot of discussion of anxiety, whether it's separation anxiety, school anxiety, anxious school refusal. Let's just throw all the terms together and we'll see what sticks. But none of them necessarily capture, I think, what we're looking for in a definition, which would be, what might the function be? Or how do we even reliably measure what is or is not happening? So we sort of come here to our main terminology. School attendance problems is our umbrella term that will describe any opportunity in which, or any time in which a child is not in school for any reason. Now, over the years, there have been kind of a push and pull between individuals looking specifically at functions of school avoidance problems, individuals sort of looking at more kind of checklists and sort of mental health views and self-reporting that is used to sort of try to come up with maybe conceptualizations of school attendance problems, which sort of leads to just lots and lots of terms being thrown around. But it does seem that the field of research that exists now is trying to focus in these four terms to really capture the topography of what is being seen, as well as some of the edge cases that might come up. So we mostly think of school attendance problems, we're thinking of that first term, school refusal, which is when we see a child who is missing school, that is having some sort of an emotional or physical reaction in going to or being at school. There's a reluctance from them. Again, this is where you probably see students who maybe are complaining, like, my stomach hurts, that's why I can't go to school, or who are actively just, crying, or younger children maybe having tantrums when it's time to get in the car and go to school. Parents are aware of the problem and are doing whatever they can to try to resolve it without help, with help, whatever they can get. But there's an active push by the parent of, I do want my child in school. I'm not choosing this to happen. This also would include students who do end up getting to school. It's a little funny to think of school refusal can happen at school, but the child gets to school and then is maybe just constantly leaving class to go to the nurse or asking to call their parents, or even students who get to school, and I'm sure some of you have worked with students like this, and you just see them in the back, they're going to white knuckle it through the day, and they make it every single day, but you know that they are miserable, and if given the chance, they would never return to this place for, again, whatever the function of that behavior. So that captures the majority of school attendance problems that we typically would see here in the United States. and is where most of the research is done. But we also do have some other categories. One would be truancy, which again is a very old term. I kind of wish they thought of a new one, perhaps, but this is really what you're thinking of a child who's absent from school or absent from parts of school and who is attempting to conceal that absence. So this would be the student that is, the Bart Simpsons of the world, like I'm on my way to school, but it would be more fun to do anything else. School withdrawal is when a parent is the main actor in the absence. The parent removes their child from school. They are not expressing an interest in their child attending school. And this wouldn't certainly include a parent who pulls their child out of school to, say, homeschool their child, because their child still isn't in a school system. That is an organized plan for some families. But it is the idea of they're not going to that school, and I'm not bringing them to that school, and I'm not interested in working towards having them go to the school. It's my hypothetical conversation that they're having at that meeting. And then finally, the flip side of that, school exclusion, in which the school doesn't want the child to be there. This could be the use of suspension illegally. It could be some sort of admission of we cannot provide this student the supports they need, and therefore we don't want them here. They should stay home the next couple of days until they've sorted things out or till this event is over. But it's the school choice to exclude or remove a child from school. So again, I hope most of you, either you're already working with families and schools on school attendance problems, or hearing this, you're hearing a lot of thoughts, your mind's racing saying, okay, I think there's room here for behavior analysis. I'm surprised we don't have way more job articles on the subject. But we don't. And my question kind of is, well, why not? I have some possible reasons. I don't have an answer, but some possible reasons. Again, when we are trying to learn about something or trying to develop treatment for a problem that we may not be as familiar with, where do we go? Why? Behavior analytic research, of course, our peer-reviewed journals. But when we only have really two major publishers, Carney and Hine, sort of putting out papers, and none of them in the journals that we would typically be looking at, it does make it harder for us to find the resources and potentially even know if we can trust those resources the same way we know we could trust BAP or JABA, behavioral interventions. Even when you do find articles, it seems like every article has a different term for what's being used, which when you're trying to learn something new is a real barrier to being able to know if you are even trying to speak the same language in terms of this paper is saying the same thing as this paper in terms of what works, what doesn't work. So that can just add one more barrier to our own searches. Also, when you're looking at assessments, almost all of them are self-reporting or questionnaires. And while I think BCBAs have become much more comfortable with the idea of using some of those kind of questionnaires and self-reporting in our treatments, I know many of us, it's still a little concerning when we don't have direct measurements and direct observations. There was a study, this is the one cited there by Hine, looking at 51 studies. What were the assessments and treatments used? Of those 51, only 2 did any direct testing at all. And only 2 used any direct observation in assessment and treatment, meaning this is a problem that when you read about it, it seems like you give a bunch of questionnaires and then you do something and the problem will be solved. Another issue is when you're, again, looking at some of the treatment options, cognitive behavior therapy is almost always recommended as an appropriate treatment. Again, I wouldn't consider that something that would be outside our realm, but it isn't something that we are necessarily trained to do without seeking out that mentorship and training, meaning we may feel like, well, I can't even do the treatment, so maybe I have no place in studying or continuing to look into school attendance problems. The other fun fact of if most of the articles are written by psychologists, most of the articles are in psychology journals, which I don't know if you've ever tried to look up psychology journals or many of those, but we don't have easy access to them. And it can be a lot to email every single author till you get a copy back. I'm sure they'd send them, but again, one more barrier to our being able to study this phenomenon and to look at how we can support more research in the area. Also, historically, for many of us, we may never have been called in to work on school attendance problems if we're working in schools or working in home-based services, because a lot of times it's considered a parent problem. Well, it's the parent's child. It's their legal responsibility to get the child to school. So if they can't do it, that's on them. Don't worry. I'm not going to call you in until it starts affecting school. Again, another potential problem. And often by the time you may find yourself called in to work with a family or work with a school on a school attendance problem, it is usually long in the life of that problem. My child hasn't been to school in 3 or 4 months. The school is threatening to take me to court. This is not the greatest time to say, well, hold on a minute. Let me see if I can find any research to support treatment. So again, a lot of barriers to why we as a field may just not have decided to join this party. But we're going to talk a little bit about what we do know, and I think talk about some directions where I hope we're all pretty excited at the end of something that we can be a part of. All right, Diana, come on, tell us what we know about assessment.
Hello, everyone. We're going to gear down now, listen to the smooth tones of Diana talk, which is a little different than Rob. And I'm just getting my timer going here because we're on a tight timetable. Okay, so what's going to happen now is I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we know about assessment from a behavior analytic perspective, what exists out there and what doesn't exist out there, in the interest of finding what's going to be the most closely hypothesized function that we can for school attendance problems. And then from there, Jackie's going to take a turn and tell us what we know thus far about how we might treat an SAP. Okay. So just as a reminder, when we think about assessment, we want to start with thinking about how should we assess this and what tools do we have at our behavior analytic disposal to do so. So generally, assessment falls into three categories. We have indirect assessments, and of those, there are plenty in this arena. There are interviews that exist, there's screening options that exist, questionnaires, and various types of logs, and I'll show you a few of those. And then we could also do some direct assessments, so we could do actual observations in the school and or ideally both in the home to see what does this behavior look like and what is the overall, context and environment in which it's occurring. And then, of course, as BCBAs and behavior analysts, we want to go to the functional analysis, right? I know y'all know this. I know that you know that just doing a questionnaire and getting a hypothesized function is not a guarantee that that function is the actual function. You got to do a functional analysis to know the actual function, right? Well, let me tell you, in this realm, these are really rare. There's virtually no research existing on running an FA for a school refusal behavior. And a large part of that is just the logistics of it, right? It's a pretty complicated behavior to try to capture. Doing so often would create reactive responses. It wouldn't really get at the true problem. And it doesn't happen that often, right? You kind of only get like the one shot a day. So we don't have a lot in that realm, but we have some other assessment pieces that can tell us about the hypothesized function of behavior that hopefully can lead us down the right path toward treatment. The other thing I think is really, really important when we think about FAs or assessment, either one, when we're talking about function, is conducting, like let's say an FA, is going to tell you what the functional behavior is, right? And that's the way we always term it. But really what a functional analysis is a big old reinforcer assessment. We have some behavior that we're targeting, and we're looking to see when it's consequented in X, Y, or Z way, which is the way that makes that behavior continue to occur. That's exactly what a reinforcer assessment is. So that function is a reinforcer. And we can look at how that behavior is maintaining that particular reinforcer in a variety of different settings. But what is not always going to be as apparent when we talk about function, it's going to be able to tell us what our why is in the moment, right? And you guys can probably guess what some of the functions of this is, right? Like I want to escape doing a test at school or whatever it might be. It's going to tell us the why in the moment, but it's not going to tell us as much we might want to know about the larger context in which that why came to occur. So there's a history there. There's often a really complex background in history that's going to support that why or help us explain why that why came to be. So the pieces that we're going to talk about specifically as a behavior analytic role are going to focus a lot on that, like why in the moment, right? But it's really important to think about it in a larger contextual paradigm and understanding the environment in which this particular response is now at its fruition. And without that larger background and the supporting professionals who are going to help us understand that background, we won't have a complete picture of what's going on. Okay, so quickly, close your eyes. think back. I'd think back to middle school, because that's usually when it all happens, right? Was there a time that you didn't want to go to school? Think. I bet you found one, right? I know I did. 6th grade, I had to move to a new school that knew no one, had to make all new friends. And a girl who was my friend yesterday, when I went up to talk to her today, looked straight at me, turned around, and just kept talking to her friend, and acted like I didn't even exist anymore. Kids are mean, right? And I didn't want to go to school. I knew no one. It's terrible. So you might have a situation like that, or you might have a whole different story that was related to not wanting to do something that was happening at school, being worried about something that might happen at school, right? Or, the pull of the Price is Right at home on those sick days is pretty strong. Maybe you want that to continue indefinitely. Chances are, when I show you these functions here in a second, the thing that you just thought of is probably going to fit into one of these categories. And that's not to say that you would necessarily go on to develop a school attendance problem, just related on maybe the one incident or my one incident. But the common functions of behavior, I think, are pretty easily understood and empathized with by many of us who have all gone through, let's say, middle school. So Kearney and colleagues set out their hypothesized primary functions of school refusal behavior specifically, and these are all based on their long history of working with this population. So take a look here. These probably seem familiar and probably potentially related to what you just thought of for your thought experiment too. So they lay out 4 primary reasons why children might refuse to go to school in the moment, right? Our momentary why. 2 of those being largely negatively reinforced responses, the function of which would be avoiding testing type situations, so aversive activities at school, maybe academically challenging experiences at school, or avoiding social situations. That one's self-explanatory to me, maybe because that's the one that hits the most closely to home for me. And then on the other side, 2 potentially positively reinforcing functions, one being attention from parents at home and or access to tangibles at home. Maybe kids aren't watching The Price is Right anymore, but they are definitely playing those video games. So these are the main 4 functions as hypothesized, and absolutely, certainly, these can intermesh and intermingle, right? We know that when you escape from behavior, you don't escape to nothing. You often escape to something better than the thing that you were escaping from. So multiply maintained behavior would not be unexpected to see in these circumstances. Now, the other forms of school attendance problems, truancy, parent withdrawal, school exclusion that Rob just talked about, are going to have potentially slightly different flavors of hypothesized function, but it's all going to end up falling most likely into those different categories. When we talk about parent withdrawal and school exclusion, there are other actors in there as well. So the parents and or the school might be making decisions about whether the child's attending school, so that's going to change things around a little bit, and the way in which you would approach your assessment related to those might change as well. So when we think about the assessment options that we have available to try to determine our in-the-moment why, these are basically what is out there. There are several different types of anxiety and depression screeners, which are quite important, but generally would fall outside of our personal realm of expertise. There are school attendance problem questionnaires, and those are indirect assessments that are going to try to get at the current environmental conditions, as well as hypothesized function of the behavior. These I will review in a second. And then direct observation is our third option here for assessment to try to figure out the why. And these can be conducted throughout the day and or during the most intensive periods of problem behavior, depending on what really works for that client. So here's a few of the questionnaires, the indirect assessments that you might find out there in the literature if you were to look around. There's SRAS, they all have very great acronyms, which is by Kearney and Silverman. There's the SNAC, I mean, come on, right? The SNAC stands for School Non-Attendance Checklist, just in case you're wondering. And obviously it would be the top pick based on name alone, but I'll tell you what the content is in a second. And then there's the ISAP as well. So those are kind of the top 3 that you might see floating around out there. Despite its awesome name, the SNAC is very simplistic in what information you're going to be gathering from it. It's asking parents to largely just like classify what the child's absence from school is. And it could be a wide range of things, all the way from my child had a doctor's appointment to we went on a family vacation. Some of those are not ultimately going to be that related to school refusal and school attendance problem as a long-standing condition. So there's that one. The ISAP is a lot more child-focused. It's asking children who are already experiencing school attendance problems what they are feeling with respect to maybe some internal emotions about attending school, including if they feel depressed, they would rather stay home, they're avoiding classmates, they feel irritated about school, they don't like their teachers, or they are anxious about something happening at home or school, and asking how that applies to them and whether that might be a reason why they're missing school. So this could be a good tool for a student who has that type of self-reflection option available to them. And then the SRASR is one in which, again, the students would be answering these questions, and it's a never to always option, running through some similar context as the ISAP. Do you stay away from school because it's hard to talk to other kids? Would you want to stay home with your parents more? Those types of questions, in an attempt to kind of get at the source here. You could also present this as an interview as well. Rob really likes this one. He wants to make sure everyone knows it's written in my notes.
I have the most experience using it.
Okay. He says it's really fast. You can
put it under my pillow at night. It's great.
Okay. You can send it via email. It is good if you're starting to work with the student, because it does kind of open up the avenues for additional conversation as well. And then you don't necessarily need to know how to score it for today, but it's kind of like the FAST almost. Like you add up the little different categories and then end up presumably with maybe one category that would be the most commonly hypothesized function for that client. And then for underneath indirect assessment, you can also look at information that's already available. Sometimes schools schools should be already taking attendance data. So if you are entering into the middle of a problem and need some back data, you can go back and see what's available in that regard. And if you are looking to add to the data that you have, you could ask parents and kids to fill out home logs. Here's a couple examples of what that looks like for home and for school. How did the child feel like the school day went? What was their distress level, etc. And you might also want to do some direct observation too. So this is where we're actually getting in there. We're going to actually get some data, right? So you would want to find the times in which the behavior is most likely to occur. And this behavior is actually lots of different behaviors, which I'll show you on the next slide. There may be times at school where you're likely to see this, and if so, you ideally would want to be present for that. So you could attempt to observe it and capture all of those antecedent and consequent arrangements that might be present. And home time, certainly, trying to get kids to schools can be very challenging, so making a time to go observe at home would be important as well. And the way in which you observe behavior could look any way you wanted it to, right? But this is Kearney's example, and as you can see, they've not just said, oh, it's school refusal, right? But it's broken down, and we have many different behaviors over here on the left-hand side that you could further break down, further operationally define as well, so that you could capture the behavior data that you were looking for, even in more detail than is presented here. The way in which he defines it is verbal or physical resistance to do any of the following activities, and you could measure that by saying, let's take a look at when the behavior should start, like it's time to wake up or it's time to get dressed, and how long before the behavior actually does start. So we have a latency measure there, and then we could also have a measure of how long the activity took to complete once it was begun. And then there are some fancy math that is there. I made a fancy math slide so you could sort of see, but this is basically just an example of a way in which you could collect data if you were to do a home observation. but you wouldn't have to do it this way for sure, but this is the way that Kearney does it. So it's taking an overall measurement of the amount of resistance that you saw, and defined as however you chose to define it, right? Using all of those different markers perhaps, the amount of resistance that you saw during each of these commonly occurring morning activities, and then you combine that total with the total time that was missed of the school day too. So both of those measures together. So, sort of an active component of resistance and then a missed component of school. Both of those are behaviors to be reduced. You look at that combined number divided by the total amount of time the child had been awake during the day to get some percentage measure. So it's a derivative measure, sure, but it is a way to kind of look at both of those component pieces, and that's the one that Kearney used and recommends. So those are a few ways in which you can approach assessment. Each of these pieces is still going to require you as a behavior analyst to, get in there and figure out what the hypothesized function might be. It's a combination of interview, questionnaire, and observation. And from that, you're going to inform what your likely treatment would be if you are wanting your treatment to be function-based. And like I said before, functional analysis there's a few forays into it here. As you can see, Lee and Miltenberger talk about functional analysis, but they're mostly doing the components we just described. And then there's one published failed attempt that didn't capture the target behavior. And like we said, that is a really potential problem with attempting a functional analysis here due to reactivity. So that area is wide open, but it may be that we're gathering the information needed to effectively provide treatment via the assessment mechanisms I just described. And now, Jackie is going to talk about treatment. There you go.
Okay, now that we have discussed the assessment of school attendance, how can we as behavior analysts now treat that attendance problem when we're faced with them? Because we might be. So in many public school districts, the first line of defense will be to contact that truancy officer, right? They figure out that you haven't been to school, they're going to contact the truancy officer. When the truancy officer calls the parents, generally what's in the media, if you watch a show, the parents are going to be shocked and mad, and they're going to be surprised, right, that their child hasn't been going to school. The parents will reassure the truancy officer that this problem is going to go away. They're going to talk to them at home, and then the next day the child's at school and it's solved, right? This is classic after-school special. But that's not really how that is going to happen, right? That's not how we as behavior analysts would solve that problem. Reports from family court are at best empathetic judges with no idea or equivalent or what we should do for these problems. And at this point, if the problem isn't solved, now parents in the school are at odds. This can add fear to the mix, right? The parents are now fearful of the school, that they're going to have some issues, and the continuous care of the child is now splintered, and it's going to be harder to work collaboratively to resolve these school attendance issues. So across many school districts, these are the primary treatment components. It's important to note that you might do one of these things, you might do all of these things, or none of these things, right? If you're at a specific school district that doesn't have the resources to handle this. Most schools will try to provide a comprehensive treatment, but the first line of defense will really focus on giving parent instructions. And typically when school districts do give parents instructions, they will give instructions that parents can't actually follow. They may try to change too much at once, or they may try to change too little at once, or they may leave one or two people in charge of this problem, which is a bigger problem, right? And so all aspects of care when we're dealing with this problem will fall to the wayside. So in considering what treatment is going to be implemented, it's going to be important to recognize that school refusal does only get worse when the child gets older, and the school refusal will become more complex with more multiple functions. And so the longer the school refusal happens, the harder it will be to treat, and the more agencies or people that will need to be involved. So how much or little of this treatment component is going to depend on the severity of the case, the function of the school refusal problem, and all of the relevant variables in play. So the focus on the next slides will be some general treatment components that you may or may not need to include, and you might not need to include all of them, but you will need to hopefully include some of them. So regardless of what components of intervention are ultimately decided upon, the parent, caregiver, and the student, and the teacher, and the support staff, right? Every single person, all of the relevant stakeholders should be informed. Psychoeducation should always start this process off. So after the psychoeducational assessment, the whole team, everyone that is involved should be meeting together and discussing the results of the assessment, information about the problem behaviors that you got in that assessment that you did. Hopefully you did some direct observation. Maybe you did an FA because you're the best, right?
Just publish that real quick.
Get that out there, right? And you're going to be talking about the problem behaviors, what you think their hypothesis function is, and a description of the sources of reinforcement that will need to be changed, along with the reason why. We know that for most things, if you tell someone what to do and you don't tell them why you're doing it, no one's going to do it. For school refusal specifically, a discussion of how feelings of anxiety can lead to problem behaviors and how short-term actions by teachers or parents may temporarily cease the problem, but at the expense of future occurrences of that behavior. So recommendations for treatment the needs to effectively carry out that treatment, and the role of each team member, right? Because it should be the whole team that has something that they need to be doing, should be clearly laid out with opportunities for questions for everyone involved. Specific skills training could also take part here during the psychoeducation meeting, such as how to set up basic contingencies at home or in school, how to empathetically respond to certain problem behaviors at home or at school, or to create good sleep hygiene habits. In the end, all the team members must feel comfortable with the recommendations and the role that they serve and the other serves. Failure to secure agreement across everyone on the team will likely result in a treatment failure. So it's better to make modifications here than later when the team members are all burnt out and frustrated. And when everyone agrees, be sure that they're not just saying yes to end the meeting, but they actually agree to their responsibility and the treatment at whole. We've all been in that meeting, right? You're like, do you have any questions? Get out of here. Another potential treatment for school refusal may be cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT. So we might not be able to run this whole treatment session, but we can absolutely be a part of it in conjunction with the school psychologist or the psychologist at hand. This may be especially relevant for school refusal that has been shown to have an escape function or to have some anxiety-related issues with it. So the first step would be to develop a hierarchy of stimuli that the child is actively avoiding or escaping at school. Kearney in 2018 is really thorough on the how-to for functions of school refusal and provides some CBT exercises, which I'll show you in a minute. So during these sessions, it's going to be helpful to teach alternative coping skills, such as when you see that aversive stimuli or you start feeling anxiety, you might practice deep breathing, you might look for distractions. And King et al. In 1988 described a therapy session, what would count as 6 50-minute sessions where we build rapport with the child, we identify those specific anxiety-producing situations, and then we train those coping skills, right, as described as above, such as when I'm feeling anxiety when I'm leaving my parent or when I'm working with another peer, what are some things that I can do? So here the focus was to teach recognition of anxiety, assess your self-talk at that moment, engage in some relaxation or differential relaxation, provide some opportunities to do that both in a safe setting without the anxiety happening, and then slowly desensitizing the child to engage in those actions in more difficult anxiety-provoking situations. And ultimately, practicing these strategies when they're gradually starting to go back to school, like one class or half a day or up to a full week. So while the child's in therapy, the parent will also have some therapy sessions so that they can learn antecedent stimulus control, contingency management, how to make good routines, how to ignore somatic complaints empathetically, right? Like, you're fine, go to school. Not helpful. We've all heard that. And how to use reinforcement for positive coping behavior. So during these final 2 sessions of the therapy for the parents can discuss progress on getting back to school and troubleshoot using behavioral skills training. So here's an example that Kearney and Al 2018 gave of the psychoeducation CBT exercise. So here, the questions that they asked are, what I feel in these moments, and then you can talk about it, what did I do, and what did I think, right? And so this is when you're thinking about school, and then you can change that and redo this exercise once you've engaged in those relaxation strategies. So another thing that we're very familiar with that can really be helpful with school refusal is contingency management. Lee and Miltenberger in '96 examined the literature responding the response to school attendance issue, and they conducted this review. Common treatments included the DRA, not surprising, extinction, and punishment. So contingency management procedures will look at reinforcing behaviors that improve school attendance or punish behavior that preclude school attendance. In addition, Kearney discussed using tangibles as a reward for attendance for set periods of going to school. So if the child stays home, there is limited access to that item. So this may work particularly well with teenagers who have a phone and who like to use them. Or video games. Or The Price is Right for me. I loved The Price is Right. And chicken noodle soup. Another strategy or treatment that might be helpful with school refusal that behavior analysts are particularly well versed in is shaping the schedule. So schedule shaping may include modifying some or all of the parts of the school setting, including the AM routine, arrival or dismissal. There may also be modifications to specific class activities or learning environments. The behavior analyst could reinforce successive approximations to going to school, maybe getting to the door, then going home, maybe getting to the door and going into the door, and then going home, and then slowly reinforcing actually going into the school. Shaping may be more often used for escape functions, although could even be used for parent attention or even tangibles. When adding in a shaping component as your treatment, it will be vital to collaborate with everyone involved, since people need to know when the student should be picked up, when the schedule will change and why, who will be present to support these modifications in a building of hundreds right across the school district. So in order for this to be effective, collaboration is going to be key. And finally, based on the assessment, it may be determined that there are skills that are lacking that make it difficult for school attendance, including functional communication or social communication. Delay and denials may be a problem, right? Or an ADL independence. So when you also may need to teach specific coping skills, students may use some, all, or none of these coping skills, such as deep breathing, relaxation, targeted relaxation, maybe some ACT. You might want to try that too. It's going to be really helpful for students to learn new responses to particular problems and how to respond to the internal sensations that they're feeling, right? Sometimes people like to think about training mindfulness in these anxiety-provoking situations. Similar to the wonderful talk on trauma and barriers that we saw yesterday, sleep and nutritional hygiene are going to be vital importance to make sure that this is a successful treatment. Taking it over to Rob to bring it on home.
All right, so hopefully in hearing about the assessment, hearing about some of the contextual variables that may or may not be relevant, thinking about some possible treatment options, most of you are saying things to yourselves. You can say them out loud if you want, but probably to yourself in this setting would be, oh, okay, that makes sense. Yes, I know how to do that. That's good, but I bet I could think of some ways to do that better, which is exciting because that's what I do when I read a lot of this research, and that's what we often do when we sort of talk about what's out there. It definitely feels like there's more of a push for function-based treatments than there might have been when some of this research was originally published, but it still does seem that there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. I really enjoyed, we've mentioned Kearney a bunch. I really enjoyed his books. I have some pictures of them at the end. He's all in the references because he's done a lot of the great work on looking at functions of school refusal specifically. But a lot of his recent studies have been really these sort of just like big think pieces, which are important, but they're really looking at sort of, school attendance around the world and what are some, big goals for the planet, which is excellent and is a very fun read. However, it doesn't help us solve some of the day-to-day problems that we might be facing as clinicians, and that we know our families and our school systems are facing. And a lot of the work coming out of psychology does seem to have the trend of, I don't like this assessment, so I made a new one, and then I did statistics, and look at my great new assessment. And it's good to have more questionnaires, but how many questionnaires do you really need to determine the function of a problem behavior? You need 0, because there are lots of better ways to find functions in most cases for problem behavior. Doesn't mean that they're not helpful, doesn't mean they can't be a component of assessment, but I'm hoping you're all saying there's a lot that still seems to be missing from that presentation. Not because we didn't put it in, but because that's what's in the research. We're just putting what's in the research, folks. We're not making stuff up. So how could you get involved as a BCBA right now? Well, certainly I think one of the things that we do pretty well in our field is we look at evidence, we look at scientific research, and I think we've really focused a lot in our field on how do we collaborate, how do we improve our compassionate care and our compassionate skills. So this might put us in a position where we could serve as maybe a team leader, say like an attendance team at the school. When problems crop up, we sort of talk about more big picture issues related to reinforcement in the building as a whole, skills training related to social skills for all of our populations, not just waiting for children to be frustrated at maybe a lack of friendship or to demonstrate some inappropriate social skills. So we could definitely take charge in situations like that. A lot of the time we're probably going to be asked to be the primary assessor, which means that we would need to do a little bit more reading on some of these questionnaires to determine what we do and do not like about them. Like Diana said, I have used the SRAS a number of times, mostly because it's one of the few that really gets at a function. At the end, you sort of have answers that sort of fit into questionnaire bins. But much like a tool like the FAST, how good is a questionnaire on behavior function? We do need to then work on what are the observations that need to be done, and probably think outside the current research and publication box of how could we more directly assess at least some of the problem behaviors surrounding the overall kind of school refusal or school attendance problem. But what better place for us to be than in the assessment component? We may serve as a primary therapist. So again, right now, what we know about treatment, there's going to be a CBT component, which typically would not be a BCBA taking that role. But certainly if we're looking at some of the skills acquisitions or some skill deficits that need to be taught using behavioral skills training, contingency management with reinforcement, we could definitely serve a role as a primary therapist for the student, potentially a primary therapist working with the families. Hey, if you need to get a good in on any group that won't let you in, just offer to take the data, make the data sheet, graph it, tell everyone what they're looking at in the graph. I mean, has anyone ever turned you down when they said, you're the behavior analyst, don't you love this stuff, right? That's the easiest way to probably get in. And we have a couple examples of sheets you could start with, but I bet all of you were looking at some of those sheets and saying, what about this? What if you added that? Which is excellent, which is exactly what this line of research needs. And then I think, again, like I said, our field has really been in a good place. There's a lot of work to do, but I think it's been at the forefront of a lot of research and kind of thought papers on how do we work with others, how do we support socially valid practices, how are we thinking about assent in our field in ways that we haven't before. So doesn't mean that we're the masters of that topic, but I think for schools, which historically have really had to look at this sort of legal punishment component for school attendance problems, why not come in with some of what we can offer in terms of what we're learning about socially valid practices, including everyone in the conversation, really building that collaboration. I mean, what better way to demonstrate that we've learned as a field and progressed as a field than to actually do more of these actions? So again, those are some places that you could get into, when you get back to work on Monday, right? If you are working with teams or working with schools, have a family that's struggling with school refusal behavior. But what about the future? And I think this is really where we have so much that we could offer the field in our collaboration. Certainly, we talked a lot about assessments. There are some nice questionnaires out there, no doubt. But I don't think any of us feel comfortable with, I did the questionnaire and I have my whole treatment plan written out. We may be able to skirt by on that ethical concern of there's not a lot out there beyond this, and all the research really failed when they did more direct type observations. But that doesn't mean we can't keep trying. Certainly there's some great ideas of how we could do more direct observation, even maybe looking at things like using a functional analysis, but at a very targeted time. So for example, your questionnaire and your direct observation points to evaluative situations being a source of concern for the student. All right, well, could we directly assess or do a functional analysis really with a focus on, say, maybe escape an escape condition? Could we try that? We might be able to do replications of that. Or maybe we could look at some of the work that Josh Jessel and Megan Boyle have done on latency ISCAs to look at, given certain stimuli, how long does it take for the student to engage in some of the problem behaviors that lead to school refusal, or potentially even a family to engage in some of the steps that could lead to withdrawal of their child. Again, there's a lot of ideas, I think, that are out there that we could apply in some of these situations. Another concern that I know I have in reading much of this work is, what is the generality of many of these findings? You do have this problem when all of the studies are in the United States or in Europe, but there's some in Japan, some in Australia. When we think about school attendance problems globally, which again, we want to start local and then think global, right? We do have to recognize that just because the function in maybe a more developed country is one thing, it's much more likely to be something else in another location due to differences in resources. But even looking locally, the generality of some of these findings, when you do the SRAS, you give some to the parents, you give some to the child, and then you sort of smush all the scores together and you come up with a function. Guess what happens? You come up with all the functions, because most of the time, what the parents think and what the child thinks are not exactly the same. Does this matter? Maybe it doesn't, in that we're looking at different perspectives. But perhaps it's very important in that you now have to put in place 4 treatments for 4 functions rather than maybe 1 treatment for the primary function, or a treatment for parents and a treatment for the child. But these are questions that I haven't even seen asked, and I definitely think we could have a place in looking at, especially if we used more objective measurements to go along with many of these questionnaires and self-report. Also, I think we don't do a great job, or at least the research hasn't done a great job of including all stakeholders. Typically, it's the parents answer questions, the child answers questions, and then the teachers and administrators are told to do something. Why don't we include teachers in these? Certainly looking at maybe, say, like some of the questionnaires that about functions of behavior type questionnaires, the interview-informed questionnaire from Greg Hanley's group. Those would be great to include teachers on. Maybe it's not the same information, but again, it tells us more about relevant variables with a richness, and it includes all individuals from the early stages of the problem rather than just reporting on what they were told to do and then perhaps they did or did not do. And again, why can't we use some of these in our assessment process to get more information, to get better treatments? And again, speaking of treatments for the future, as much as there have been publications on the school attendance problems since 1915, I would be hard-pressed to say that there is a body of evidence supporting that there are 100% foolproof treatments out there. Certainly, there's a lot of good work that's been done and a lot that can be built on, but I think there's still much more iteration that needs to happen. One thing would be, what are we even measuring when we talk about school attendance? We probably think, well, how many days they're in school or how many hours they're in school. But looking at some of the studies out there, some studies are looking at measures of anxiety or global functioning or reported fear of school after and before and after treatment. Some folks looked at quality of life or ratings of social adjustment. Very few times did they actually look at whether the function that originally led to some of the problem behaviors around school attendance or school refusal were still valid or still relevant for the individual. So when we're measuring all these different things, it makes it very hard to determine what is it we're actually doing when we talk about treatment. And what's behavior analysis really good at? Operationally defining and measuring behavior that's socially significant. This could be a really great place for us to come in and work with schools to make meaningful measurement scales. Another piece is the generality across time. There's this kind of amusing study. It's a little sad, but it's kind of amusing by Tolan et al. In 2009, where they used a lot of the treatment options that Jackie went over. They pretty much just sort of went down the list. And you look at the treatment data, which was really about attendance in school, and it showed an improvement. You don't usually get graphs in a lot of these studies, but this one did have graphs. And then they did a follow-up. A few months later, they called 4 adolescents who were in the study. One they couldn't get a hold of. One continued to have attendance issues even after treatment 3 months later. One just said, I'm going to a private school because I hate my current school. And guess what? Problem was solved. Was going to school, no problems. And the other one said, I hate my school. I'm dropping out. I got my GED and went to college. So just measuring things like attendance might not capture the fact that, well, we increased attendance, but it didn't result in improved attendance. And in some cases, continued attendance at the location may have been harmful to some of the individuals because perhaps that environment wasn't going to support long-term change for that person. Also, when we look at how many questionnaires there are, who do you need to be involved in treatment, there are so many places to streamline this process. But it's hard to streamline if we don't already know what works most consistently for the greatest number of students. Knowing function will help with that. But there's just so much that isn't known that when we come up with treatment, I mean, how many of you, when you work with teachers, if you threw up that package of different changes, their schedule is going to be like this, you need to cut down the number of this, you need to have break spaces or do this with that and teach them that skill, how many teachers do you think could follow through with all those recommendations with high degree of procedural integrity? You would be lucky if they held on to the big packet of papers you gave them and didn't just immediately throw them in the trash and say, thanks, but no thanks. What if we just go back to the old it's a parent problem? That worked pretty well for me in terms of escaping from, aversive situations. I kid, I love our teachers, but again, these are the situations that we often find ourselves in when we're consulting. Also looking at how are we, kind of going back to Dr. Kalu's talk on buffers the other day, how are we supporting buffers when it comes to school attendance problems? We know a lot of relevant factors, but how many of our schools are using multi-tiered systems of support, or PBIS, or teaching teachers how to use praise effectively, or showing teachers and paraprofessionals how to use portions of behavior skills training to show some of the social emotional learning skills that all of our schools want our kids to do, but we sort of just throw the pillows. There was a great talk about that yesterday. Kind of throw the pillows in the corner and buy a bunch of fidgets and call it a day. There's just so much more we can do, both in the moment of treatment, in individualized treatments, but in global treatment plans. And as a field, I know one of the things that drives me nuts is how it feels like nobody wants us at the table till there's the worst kind of a problem. I think, and when we talked about it, this was really about one area where there's a need, and there's so much information that I think behavior analysis could add to the conversation and really continue to show our growth and our value to the wider range of professionals. Because it's very hard for us to reach our goal of socially significant change if we're really only going to get called in when things are at their absolute worst. And the research to support what we need to do is not robust enough for us to even feel that we have all the answers and all we need to know to provide effective change under those conditions. So again, we need to move beyond just focusing in a few areas, and really, I think school attendance problems, and we talked about school attendance problems as being a great place for us to take what we know and add relatively quickly, I think, in hope. So sometimes on the show, if you want more information, certainly we've done a number of episodes on school refusal assessments. We talk a lot about the ISAP in one of our episodes. We had an interview with Dr. Carney a while back talking about some of the challenges related to school attendance problems, and then some episodes on, Diana,
We're coming up to do pairings.
do you want to do, I've already run out of time. We're already running out of time.
Yeah, so?
Oh, okay, sorry. Diana, come do pairings. I didn't know it was...
Pairings is my section. So Pairings is a part of our podcast in which I describe other episodes that people might want to listen to if they liked this one, so that they can, reference back to other context episodes. And so I had just a few to tell you about, and then I will let Rob have the microphone back.
You go ahead. You should finish up. I stole your thunder. I feel bad.
Okay, so if you like this episode, which is not an episode, but if you like this talk, you could also go back and listen to Episode 18, in which we talk about transitions. Episode 58, in which we talk about school refusal specifically. Episode 141, assessments that you didn't know existed. Bonus episode Rob did as an interview with Dr. Chris Kearney on school refusal. And then episodes 154 and 161, which are both on teaching mindfulness, and one of them was with Dr. Joshua Felver. So any of those might be of interest to you. Do you want me to keep talking?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Further reading, we highly recommend both of these books that are over here on the side. They are both by Dr. Kearney, Helping School Refusing Children and Their Parents, and Managing School Absenteeism at Multiple Tiers. So you can enjoy those. And most of all, we just want to thank you for coming.